Hello, and welcome to the Songwriters Workshop. This is the series where I attempt to write songs based on the process and techniques of famous songwriters. Each video looks at a different songwriter's writing habits, musical inspirations, and creative process, while also including an original song written using those techniques. So let's take a look at our next songwriter. This video will look at Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. Brian grew up in Hawthorne, California in the 40s and 50s with his brothers Carl and Dennis Wilson. From an early age, Brian began to break down songs and vocal harmonies by ear, especially those of the Four Freshmen, and teach them to his brothers. In 1961, Brian, Carl, and Dennis formed a band with their cousin Mike Love and friend Al Jardine under the name The Pendletones. Dennis would recommend to Brian that he write a song about their local surfing scene, despite Dennis being the only member of the band that had any interest in surfing.
Hey, I'm not going.
Come on, Brian. Let's go surfing now.
Everybody's learning how. Come on a safari with us.
The band's first single, Surfin', written by Brian and Mike, would become a local hit and cause their early label of Candix Records to change the band's name to the Beach Boys. Brian and the Beach Boys would continue with the surfing theme with albums like Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, and Surfer Girls for the early 1960s, and would quickly gain fame to rival that of the Beatles. However, by the mid-60s, Brian would want to move away from the usual surfing and car themes of the Beach Boys' early albums to a more sophisticated sound, inspired to do so by the Beatles' album Rubber Soul. In 1964, Brian would also suffer a nervous breakdown while on a plane that would halt his touring career with the Beach Boys, and signal the beginnings of his struggles with mental illness, which we'll talk about more later in the video. With Brian off the road and in the studio looking for a new sound, he would begin to work on the 1966 album Pet Sounds, one of the most influential and impactful pop records ever released, which included songs like God Only Knows, Wouldn't It Be Nice, and Brian's arrangement of Sloop John B. Brian worked with lyricist Tony Asher to write the songs, and used the session musicians from the infamous Wrecking Crew for the backing tracks, including Hal Blaine on drums and Carol Kay on bass. After Pet Sounds, Brian and Mike would write the song Good Vibrations, which would take the Beach Boys over half a year alone to record, and is one of the most important works of the era. Brian then started working with lyricist Van Dyke Parks on what would have been the next album for the Beach Boys, Smile. However, Brian's worsening mental health would mean that the album would not be released. Brian would eventually fall under the care of Dr. Eugene Landy, a psychologist who implemented a 24-hour control over Brian's life. After Landy forced himself into a songwriting and business partnership with Brian, as well as attempting to write himself into Brian's will, Brian's family and loved ones would step in to remove Landy from Brian's life. During the Landy years, Brian released his first solo album in 1988, and Brian has continued to write and release music, including revisiting the Smile songs with Brian Wilson Presents Smile in 2004. Brian remains an icon, often regarded as a music and recording genius. The research for this video will come mainly from Brian's 2016 autobiography, I Am Brian Wilson, not to be confused with his first autobiography, Wouldn't It Be Nice, My Own Story, that was largely ghostwritten by Landy, and which Brian has disowned. We will also pull from interviews and documentaries done on Brian, including the 1995 Don Was documentary, I Just Wasn't Meant for These Times, and the 2021 documentary, Long Promised Road. In his book, Brian says, "What is a song exactly? It's something that starts as an idea and becomes more than that. It becomes physical and emotional and spiritual. It comes out into the world. It can soothe you when you're feeling at your worst. It can make you happy when you're sad." So let's take a look at how Brian writes songs. Let's begin with how Brian uses his musical influences and the people around him to create songs. We briefly touched on Brian's fascination with the harmonies of the Four Freshmen in the intro, but having other people's music influence his own in interesting ways is a big backbone to Brian's musical identity. In comparing a song to a recipe, Brian says, "When you look at a recipe, it lists ingredients before it tells you how to cook them. Those were my ingredients. Beautiful songs by singers like Rosemary Clooney, vocal harmonies from groups like the Four Freshmen, and the Boogie Woogie. Those are the sounds that started moving around in my mind." Brian was able to take these influences and make them wholly his own. He says of these songs, "I started humming that, but it changed in my head. It combined with other songs I knew. And eventually it didn't sound like anything I had heard before. It sounded like maybe it was my own." Brian also collaborated with many people, like Mike Love, Van Dyke Parks, and Tony Asher, to help create some of his best songs. He says, "If people make great music their whole life, they have to be smart about knowing it's at least partly because of the people working with them. Music starts in your mind, but it ends up always being a collaboration. There are too many sounds happening all at once for it to be only one person." So Brian's process involves taking the music that he loves, the chord progressions, the melodies, the styles, and recreating them into his own, all while feeding off the creative energy of the people he is working with. However, it is what he does with these ideas and influences that makes him truly unique, which brings me to my next point about Brian's process, something that many songwriters have pointed out about his work, that he is able to balance sophistication with simplicity. For starters, Brian seems to write the initial ideas of his songs very quickly, saying, "The songs that come the fastest are the ones I like the most. California Girls took about an hour and a half." But he says in his book that that is just the first part of the process, the part where I'm at the piano just playing and listening to what I'm playing. That's the way I discover new songs. So that is how I started, sitting at the piano, playing until I hit on something that I liked. And for this writing session, I tried not to overthink what I was playing or singing about. I just wrote. Brian has the unique talent of writing simple and relatable songs without coming off as superficial. And after reading his book, I think it comes from the fact that Brian is just a very straightforward and honest person. He says about writing songs, "The true inner nature of our voices came out to play, you know? I have a soul, you know? And maybe, once in a blue moon, your soul might come out and play, and just express itself." Brian's song "In My Room" that he wrote with Gary Usher is often cited as an example of Brian's honesty in songwriting. The simple idea of the feeling of security and escape from turmoil is told in such a truthful way that you can't help but relate to the song. As Brian said in an interview with Paul Zolo, "It pays off to be courageous. Courage pays off. Honesty pays." But Brian is able to take these honest, simple ideas and do complex and interesting things with them musically, without losing the innocence. He is able to build them into something more. He says, "When you think songs are just for you, you pay special attention to them and then you grow from them. It's like a building going up. You have a foundation, and then you keep adding stories until you look down, and you're so far from the ground that you don't know how you got up there. That's how it's always been for me." And how does Brian build these foundations? With harmony and arrangements. Brian was a pioneer in innovative and dense vocal harmonies and complicated instrumental combinations. As I mentioned before, Brian honed his vocal harmony skills by learning, piece by piece, the vocal lines of groups like the Four Freshmen. He said of learning these songs, "I tried to understand the way their voices were working, and to take their songs apart like they were clocks, and then rebuild them for me and Dennis and Carl. I'd listen to them until I understood the main melody and the vocal harmonies above and below it. And from learning these parts, he gained an understanding of how vocal lines fit together and played off of each other." He says, "When you build up harmonies, lots of it is teaching people parts, but some of it is listening to the sound they're already making and building something out of that." For a basic starting point of writing a vocal harmony, Brian says, "You start with one voice and go a third up and a third up to an octave. All of it is serving this one main melody, and it's really wonderful." But of course, in line with his sophistication from simplicity, Brian built these simple harmonies into something more complex and unexpected, saying, "We practiced harmonies until they sounded right to us. Then we changed a few notes around to make it sound more exciting or unexpected." So again, this is in line with Brian's technique of taking something simple and truthful and building upon it into something unique. And the same goes for his musical and instrumental arrangements. As the bedrock of his songs, Brian will often use standard chord progressions from rock and blues, like the boogie woogie mentioned before, but change them to make them his own. One often cited example of this is Brian's tendency to put the fifth of a triad chord as the bass note, something that I stole from Brian for my song. And Brian does all of his arrangements in his head and reacts to what he's hearing. He says, "When I think of an arrangement for a song, I don't get it down on paper right away. Other people take lots of notes. It's mostly mental with me. I was working out the arrangement in my head. I might lay down a vocal and peel it up. I might turn down a track so I could hear another track in isolation. So when I was putting together the demo of my song, I tried to instinctively react to what I thought the song needed, imagining in my head what certain instruments and harmonies would sound like. And by using multiple instruments in an arrangement, something Brian learned from Phil Spector, he is able to layer the texture of a song." He says, "In lots of interviews, people have asked me what I would have been if I had been born in a different time. I think I would have been a classical composer. I would have been like Bach, using counterpoint, layering things. Of all the composers, he's the one that makes the most sense to me. So while I was crafting my demo, like Brian, I tried to hear in my head how each part would layer into the song as a whole, adding to its complexity and effectiveness." However, in order to talk about what goes on in Brian's head, we need to talk about how his mental health affected his songwriting. Brian says in his book, "So many people on the planet deal with some kind of mental illness. I've learned that over the years, and it makes me feel less lonely. It's part of my life. There's no way around it. My story is a music story and a family story and a love story, but it's a story of mental illness too." As I mentioned, Brian suffered a panic attack on a flight in 1964, and would continue to struggle with mental health problems in the forms of anxiety, manic depression that left him unable to get out of bed for long periods of time, and auditory hallucinations that made him hear derogatory voices in his head. Brian talks about the voices, saying, "What made it worse, at least early on, was that the voices in my head that were trying to do away with me were in a crowded space. They were in there with the other voices that were trying to make something beautiful. Voices were the problem, but also the answer. The answer was in harmony. That's what I worked on after I came off the road in 1964. There was a period where I tried to make music that captured all those voices." So for Brian, his method of dealing with his mental illnesses was to see that they were a part of who he was, and accept he could either be controlled by them, or use them to do what he loves. He says, "One of the stories on the news was about how anxiety and creativity are linked. There was some big study at a university, and the doctors who did the study said that anxiety and creativity are sort of the same thing. Both of them are about dealing less with what's in front of you and more with what's in your head. Listening to what's in your head, especially when you're a person with anxiety, leads to negative emotions, but they're also a form of imagination. If you can worry about problems when there aren't any problems around, then you can also think of stories or songs when there aren't any stories or songs around. You can make things go from not existing to existing." However, there were periods of Brian's life where his mental illnesses did prevent him from writing. But as Brian learned, it's about recognizing when you are having these negative thoughts and feelings, and not giving into them, and not letting them stop you from creating. He says, "If you spend your life trying to find songs, you realize pretty quickly that you're not the first. People have been doing that as long as there have been people. And if there are periods in your life when you stop doing it, because something distracts you or makes you weak, you realize how important it is to jump right back into the game. Songs are out there all the time, but they can't be made without people. You have to do your job and help songs come into existence." And, as Brian said, it is important to know that you are not alone. It is important as a songwriter and as a person to ask for help from the people you trust and accept it when you need it. In talking about a scene from the biopic Love and Mercy, in which Hal Blaine gives a young Brian Wilson words of encouragement after a recording session, Brian says, "I liked that scene because it reminded me of one of the reasons I kept going all those years. I kept going to protect my love for music. And eventually, I found people who could help protect me also." Brian's process is one of the most interesting and complex that I have researched for this channel, combining a mix of his musical influences and the intricate way he weaves together simple ideas into a tapestry of harmony and instrumentation, all of which lives in his equally complicated mind. He truly deserves his title as a songwriting genius. Now here is the demo of the song that Brian helped me write. In the light of the sun, in the light of the sun. You are not alone because the sun will always shine for you. Hold on to the light and soon the light will hold on to you. Hold on to the light and soon the light will hold on to you. Hold on to the light and soon the light will hold on to you. Shine. Thank you for joining me for this video on Brian Wilson. I hope you took as much away from his process and story as I did. And please be sure to like and subscribe for more videos in the future. I'll see you at the next song.